Well, hello again, and this is the second of these two short videos, and I want to do something a little bit different here and introduce you to another couple of images that I think are really interesting for some general ways of thinking about law, politics, power, and so on. And so I'm going to go straight into these images so that we can get straight to the interesting things. And I'm going to go over there and this time, I want us to think a little bit about public space and images of public space, because it seems to me that there's a key question here that goes, way back to the ancient Greeks about what it means to be a member of the public and how spatial experience, being in a public, in the agora or the forum, for example, are an important exercise of democracy and, let's say, the social contract. And I think that images have been really interesting ways of representing different ideas about the relationship, let us say, between sovereignty, between legal power and the citizenry. And that these kind of ideas have shifted from time to time. And I actually want to connect it to our experience in 2020, which is why I've called this plague. Because I think that plagues or epidemics, pandemics, have been and are very important in the reconstituting of the relationship between sovereign power and the public sphere. That's a good way of putting it, between sovereign power and the public sphere. So let me take you to a really old image of public space, and it comes from a really important mural fresco, a huge fresco in the middle of Siena called "The Allegory of Good Government and the Effects of Good Government." And it's a huge mural. It's in the most important legal space, both the legislative and the judicial heart of Siena. And these images, incredibly important and complicated images, really are the visual constitution of the Republic of Siena in the 14th century. This is a series of paintings done in 1337 to 1339. And what we can see here is the heart. I mean, it's a huge fresco that is about 5 or 6 meters long, that takes all of one huge wall in this central room, the place where the nine, that's the ruling power in Siena in the 14th century, these 9 people, met and deliberated on laws and justice. So all across one wall is this huge dominating mural of the effects of good government. And we can see that the effects of good government are a vibrant public space, a public which is happy and safe and contented. There are signs about, there are soldiers that are guarding the walls and things like that. But in the middle, as we can see here, we've got people going about their business. We've got people singing, selling things, conversing. Commerce is incredibly important. Social life is incredibly important. What is good government for, says Lorenzetti? But in order to protect and nourish, so perhaps that's the better word, nourish the public sphere. And at the heart of this image, aesthetically, it's right at the heart of this image. And in fact, all of the perspectival points of this image radiate out from this central group of people, 9, and remember that the 9 was the magic number in Siena, 9 dancers singing and dancing. For a long time, this was thought to be women, but in fact, I think it's pretty clear they're young men doing a particular kind of celebratory dance. One person in the middle here banging the tambourine, and the next involved in this very complicated dance move. And I think dance is really quite symbolic here for the public space generally. That is, for a way in which we come together as individuals, learn how we exist in an embodied form, and then work together towards some greater goal. So there's an idea of corporeal harmony, of embodied harmony at the heart of this image of the public space. It's neither individualized nor collectivized, but somehow are working together. And I think the image of the dance is a really powerful image of a certain kind of citizen-led public sphere that Lorenzetti places at the very heart of what government is about. Now, if you go forward another few centuries, you come to this image, very, very, very famous image, the front cover of Hobbes' Leviathan. And it tells a very different story about the relationship between sovereignty and the public sphere. You know, right? Hobbes's story is we need violence, we need a monster, we need this supreme figure that is capable of enforcing security and order on a recalcitrant populace, right? The public space, the public sphere in Hobbes becomes a kind of a danger rather than a purpose, as it was in Lorenzetti. It becomes the very thing that we have to control through this monster. He says, if we don't have this monster, this sovereign who is all powerful and from whom any rights or values or responsibilities stem, then what we have is the life of man, famous line here, nasty, brutish and short. And if you look closer, you'll see under this monstrous figure of the king or the sovereign, we've got this scene of the town that the sovereign is protecting, but radically different from Lorenzetti's town. Here is a town that is completely devoid of human life. It is utterly barren and empty. People live safe, but not in public. They live in this private realm. And the public space, the public sphere, is actually a thing to be disciplined and controlled. Now, the general story that's told about Hobbes is that he had this pessimistic view of the relationship between sovereignty and publics because of his experiences in the English Civil War, which was a horrendous letting of blood, horrible violence, an awful period in which, you know, brother against brother and all of that sort of thing, many, many people died. And Hobbes was traumatized by that experience, and he was looking for a way of stopping that ever happening again. He said, the monster, Leviathan, the all-powerful sovereign is what we need. And if you look at this picture of the public space guarded by the sovereign, what you'll see, particularly on the left-hand side here, are soldiers, right? Not people dancing, but soldiers making sure that nobody is in that square. So it's a denuded public square controlled by soldiers. So the story of the Civil War is relatively familiar. What I want to point out to you is that there is another part to this story. And if you look at the right-hand side of this image, down in the bottom right-hand corner, right next to the house, you'll see two strange figures wearing funny hats. And my guess is that in 2019, nobody knew what those funny hats were, but in 2020, many people do. They are funny, beaked, pointed hats that fitted over people's faces like giant masks in order to protect plague doctors from the plague. They are plague masks. And if you look online, you'll see, you know, they look like birds' beaks, right? They were called beaks, right? One of the reasons we call doctors, we relate to kind of language of beaks and birds and things like that. So why is this? The difference between Lorenzetti, which was painted 5 years before the Black Death came to Europe, and Hobbes, 200 years later, certainly, but what had happened in that time was that the plague had returned to London, not once when it killed something like a third or a half of the population of London, but it then returned every generation or two for 300 years and was still returning every generation or two in Hobbes' own lifetime. And each time it killed about 10 or 20% of the population of London. So the plague was a constant reality in public life in England and something to be constantly contained and controlled. So Hobbes' anxieties about the public square, about the public sphere, about public life are not just a result of the Civil War. They are also a result of the plague. The plague is one of the things that led to this dark, pessimistic view of the dangers of mingling, of the dangers of participating in public, and of the need to control public spaces, to discipline publics rather than to embrace or encourage them. So these radically different visions of public squares and public life, I think, have a lot to do with the impact of the Black Death, of the plague. And of course, now we're in a different period. But let me just point out, you know, a quick point. We could spend a lot of time talking about this, but I would say, in general, what we've seen over the last 20 to 30 years has been the rise of neoliberalism. And the rise of neoliberalism is intensely distrustful of democratic life. Neoliberalism is about maximizing economic opportunity, individualizing economics, and it's about actually a strong state. Ironically, neoliberalism often presents itself as being about the small state, but the evidence is very clear that neoliberal thinkers and neoliberal government has led to larger states, more powerful states, more oppressive states, in the interests of controlling the dangerous socialist collectivist forces of democracy. So the public space, public life, and democracy are seen as forces of collectivization, and neoliberalism has always been about economics and individualism. So there is this tension, this opposition, in fact, between democratic life and neoliberal governance. So how might that be manifested in visual forms? Now, I'm just going to click on this and we'll see if this is successful in turning us to a short video of a video game that I came across only a few months ago. And this is just a short video of one of these, as you can see, a pretty cheap video game. It's called Push 'em All. And it seems to me it's like a playbook of neoliberal governance, which is to try and clear the spaces of the public sphere of these nuisances, which you and I call citizens, right? And you can see they're quite remarkable. They're holding up their hands, they're running away in some cases, but your job to win the game is to push all of these people overboard. That's the actual language that the game uses. Throw them overboard, it says. Clear the zone. I'm not sure if we're going to get any sound out of this. No, we're not going to get any sound, but that doesn't matter. You can see how the game is all about, as I said, throwing people overboard. And throwing people overboard. In fact, there's a line that the game uses, and it's this. It says, push them all, is the name of the game. And then it says, if you throw somebody overboard, you're legally skilled. Now, I think that that's really kind of amazing, that the language is not just of winning the game, but of being legally skilled. And we can see all around the world, certainly in Australia, and I imagine it's at least to some extent true in Canada too, the maximising of government power to control public spaces. Now, what the pandemic has done has not caused these kinds of processes, but merely enhanced or weaponised them. These are processes of governmental control over demonstrations, over dissent, over public space. Look at what's been happening about, Extinction Rebellion and so forth. That has been going on for 20 years. Governments have been accruing increasing powers to limit public space, to limit public activism, to brand dissenters or protesters as terrorists, and arrest them, incarcerate them, often secretly, often without a warrant, and so on and so forth. And the pandemic in 2020 has merely accelerated these underlying processes. It has given a new legitimacy to the language, which the game Push 'em All echoes, of cleaning zones, right? It has made the empty public square a public health desire, as well as an economic and a political desire, right? It has turned economic values of order, control, and security into public health values. It has turned public interactions, social democratic life, into kind of dangers of contagion, dangers of pollution. We can see these as images about, demonstrations and the control of demonstrations in Berlin or in Vancouver or in Sydney, and of course, in a place like Hong Kong. Very obviously, we can see the echoes of this kind of thing, the way in which order and emptiness connote hygiene, connote cleanness. There's something therapeutic about them. Now, that's not in some ways to, in any way to kind of deny the reality of the pandemic or the importance of controlling the pandemic in any way, but to point out that now we have a new set of language values which echoes these underlying processes of undermining the public space and undermining the public sphere. Those same echoes and those same strategies were already being deployed by Thomas Hobbes in the 17th century. And we now see a resurgence not only of forces of government control, security, and the language of counterterrorism and the like, but the resurgence of public health languages, as well as political and economic languages that echo those values. That is to say that the images, and in the 21st century, that also means the video games we play tell us an enormous amount about the society we live in, the rhetoric that those societies use, and the goals that they seek to legitimize. What it seems to me most chilling about a game like Push 'em All is the way that it normalizes, turns into a normal game, these processes of discipline and control, and legitimates an aesthetic of zone cleared or of throwing people overboard as being something that would be inhabited by young players of who knows what age, and would become to seem normal aesthetic practice, right? So the aesthetics and the politics of neoliberalism are intensely woven together, and that really is the take-home that I want to leave you with, that idea that aesthetics, whether we're talking about Lorenzetti in the 14th century, Hobbes in the 17th century, or Push 'em All in the 21st century, that aesthetics and politics are bound up together, and that they are mutually constitutive and mutually imbricated. So it's not just that the aesthetics is illustrating the politics, but that aesthetics is actually shaping, transforming our emotional values, the way in which we connect to political and economic and social ideas. So there is a lot at stake in the art, the images, and even in the video games that we play. Well, I think that will do for today, and I look forward to seeing at least some of you live in another few weeks' time.